There's something I need you to understand. What you lost was never meant to break you. It was meant to build you. That job that slipped away, that relationship that crumbled, that opportunity you thought was yours. Listen to me. It wasn't rejection, it was redirection. God does not take something away without preparing to replace it with something greater. But here's the catch. You have to trust Him even when it hurts, even when it makes no sense. What you lost was never meant to break you. It was meant to build you. It may not feel like that right now. When something you love, something you worked for, something you poured your time, your energy, and your heart into is suddenly gone, it feels like the end. It feels like the ground has been pulled out from under you, like everything you've built is crumbling. You sit there asking, "Why, God? Why would you take this from me? Why would you let this happen?" But what if I told you that what you lost was never meant to stay? What if I told you that what you're grieving over was actually keeping you from something greater? See, we don't always recognize it in the moment, but sometimes the very things we hold on to the tightest are the things keeping us from reaching our full potential. God sees what we cannot. He knows what we do not. And when He removes something from your life, He's not punishing you. He's preparing you. You ever tried to fit into a place that no longer serves you? You ever stayed in a relationship long past its expiration date? You ever clung to a job, a position, a title, because you were too afraid of what would happen if you let it go? We do it all the time. We hold on to what is familiar, even if it's not good for us. We hold on to what is comfortable, even if it's limiting us. And sometimes the only way God can get us to move, the only way He can push us towards something greater, is by taking away what we refuse to release. That loss you're crying over, it's not the end of your story. It's the beginning of something new. God never takes without giving. He never removes without replacing. But here's the thing. He doesn't just give you back what you lost. He doesn't just replace it with something similar. No, when God restores, He always increases. He always elevates. What He gives you will always be greater than what was taken away. But you have to trust Him. And trust isn't easy when you're in pain. It's not easy when you're standing in the middle of loss, looking at the pieces of what used to be. It's not easy when you're questioning why things didn't work out, why the door closed, why the person left. But faith is about believing even when you don't understand. It's about knowing that just because you can't see the full picture doesn't mean God isn't painting a masterpiece. Look at Job, a man who had everything, wealth, health, family, success, lost it all in an instant. And for a moment, it seemed like God had abandoned him. But Job didn't turn away. He didn't curse God. He held on, and because of that faith, because of that trust, God restored everything he lost and gave him twice as much as before. That's the kind of God we serve, a God of restoration, a God of multiplication, a God who doesn't just give back what you lost, but gives you more, gives you better, gives you greater. But here's the part we don't like. Before restoration, there's always a season of waiting, and waiting is hard. When you've lost something, when you're struggling, when you're hurting, the last thing you want to do is be patient. You want answers. You want relief. You want things to be fixed right now. But God works in His own time, and His timing is always perfect. Maybe you lost that job because God has something better lined up for you, something that aligns with your purpose instead of just paying your bills. Maybe that person walked away because God saw something you couldn't, and He's making room for the right one. Maybe that dream didn't work out because God is preparing a bigger one that will take you further than you ever imagined. You have to believe that what's coming is greater than what's gone. You have to believe that your loss is not a setback, it's a setup. God isn't finished with you. He hasn't forgotten you. What He's doing behind the scenes, what He's preparing for you, is far greater than what you thought you lost. So don't lose faith. Don't let the pain of what's missing blind you to the blessings that are coming. Hold on. Keep trusting. Keep believing. Because one day soon, you're going to look back at this moment, at this loss, and you're going to realize it wasn't a loss at all. It was a divine exchange. God was making space. God was making room. And what he's about to place in your life is something so powerful, so beautiful, so much greater than anything you could have ever imagined. Stay faithful. Stay ready. Because when God replaces what you've lost, you'll understand why it had to happen the way it did, and you'll thank him for it. Rejection is one of the hardest things to face in life. It cuts deep. It shakes your confidence. It makes you question everything. Why wasn't I chosen? Why did they leave? Why did that door close? But what if I told you that rejection is not the end of your story? What if I told you that every no you've ever received was simply a step toward a greater yes? See, we take rejection personally, but God sees it differently. He doesn't see rejection as a loss. He sees it as protection. When something doesn't go your way, when someone walks away, when a door slams shut in your face, it's not because you weren't good enough. It's not because you weren't worthy. It's because God has something else in store for you, something that aligns with his plan, not just your desires. Think about it. How many times have you looked back at something you desperately wanted, something you prayed for, and now you thank God it didn't work out? That relationship you thought was the one, that job you begged for, that opportunity that felt like your big break. At the time, it hurt to lose it. At the time, it felt like rejection. But now, from where you stand, you can see that if you had gotten what you wanted, you would have settled for less than what you deserved. God sees what we cannot. He knows what we do not. And sometimes he has to block the wrong thing so he can lead us to the right thing. He has to close a door because we're too afraid to walk away from it ourselves. You ever notice how we get comfortable with things that don't even serve us? We stay in places that are beneath us, in relationships that drain us, in jobs that don't fulfill us, just because they're familiar. But God doesn't want you settling for less than he intended for you. He wants you to walk in your full potential. And sometimes the only way to push you forward is to take away the thing that's holding you back. That's why rejection is actually a gift. It may not feel like one in the moment, but later on, when you step into what was meant for you, you'll realize that every closed door, every heartbreak, every setback was actually setting you up for something better. Think about Joseph. His own brothers rejected him, sold him into slavery, left him for dead. He was thrown into prison, forgotten by the very people he helped. If anybody had a right to feel abandoned, to feel like God had turned his back on him, it was Joseph. But what happened? Because of that rejection, he was positioned exactly where he needed to be. What others meant for evil, God used for good. Z-E. The very path that looked like suffering was actually the road to his destiny. He became a ruler, he saved nations, and in the end he stood before the very people who rejected him and said, "What you meant for harm, God used for good." And that's exactly what God is doing in your life. That rejection is not a punishment, it's positioning. You didn't get that opportunity, that's because God has a better one. That person left you, that's because they weren't meant to go where you're headed. That dream didn't work out, that's because God has a bigger one. But here's the thing, you have to trust him. You have to stop chasing after closed doors. You have to stop trying to force things that aren't meant for you. When God removes something, let it go. When he says no, accept it, because the longer you hold on to what was, the longer you delay what could be. Sometimes we waste so much energy trying to make something work that was never meant to be ours in the first place. We cry over doors that God locked. We chase people that he removed. We beg for situations to turn around when he's already written a different ending. And all the while, God is saying, if you would just trust me, if you would just let go, I would show you what I have for you. You may not see it now, but one day you'll understand. One day you'll look back and realize that what you thought was rejection was really redirection. you'll see that every time you were told no, every time something was taken away, it was because God was leading you somewhere greater. So stop questioning, stop doubting, stop thinking you're not enough just because something didn't work out the way you planned. You are more than enough. You are exactly where you're supposed to be, and what's coming next will make you grateful for every rejection you ever faced. Because when God steps in, when He replaces what you lost, when He brings you what was truly meant for you, you'll realize that what you thought was a setback was actually your setup. And you'll thank Him for every no that led you to the right yes. Trusting the process is one of the hardest things to do, especially when the process involves pain, loss, and uncertainty. It's easy to have faith when everything is going your way, when doors are opening, when opportunities are flowing. But what about when things fall apart? What about when you lose what you thought you could never live without? What about when God takes something from you and you don't understand why? See, this is where real faith comes in. Faith is not just believing in God when things are good. Faith is trusting Him when things don't make sense, when you're hurting, when you're confused, when you're standing in the middle of your loss, looking at the empty space where something used to be, and you're wondering why. But let me tell you something. God never removes without reason. If He took it, it was either because it was holding you back, it was hurting you, or it was never meant for you in the first place. And when you're in that moment, when you're dealing with the heartbreak, the disappointment, the setback, it won't make sense. It'll feel unfair. It'll feel like you're being punished. But you have to understand, God is not trying to break you. He's trying to build you. You see, we pray for blessings, but we don't always pray for preparation. We want the promise, but we don't always want the process. And the process is where God does His best work. The process is where He removes what is weak so He can build you up stronger. The process is where He stretches you, grows you, refines you, and prepares you for what's next. Look at the story of David. Before he became king, before he stepped into his destiny, he spent years in the wilderness. He was anointed, he had the promise, but he had to go through the process. He had to fight battles, he had to be rejected, he had to be tested. And at any point, he could have given up. He could have said, God, you promised me a kingdom, but all I see is struggle. You promised me greatness, but all I feel is loss. But David trusted the process. He kept going. He kept believing. And in the end, he stepped into everything God had planned for him. Now think about yourself. Think about what you're going through right now. Maybe you lost something you thought you needed. Maybe you're in a season where things aren't making sense. Maybe you're looking at your life wondering why God hasn't stepped in yet. But what if right now you're in your process? What if God is working even though you can't see it? What if this season of waiting, this season of struggle, is actually the preparation for something greater? Because that's how God works. He doesn't just hand you the blessing, He makes sure you're ready for it. He doesn't just give you the promise, He makes sure you can handle it. And that means sometimes you have to go through the fire. Sometimes you have to be broken down before you can be built up. Sometimes you have to lose something to gain something greater. But you can't give up in the middle of the process. You can't let the pain of what you lost make you forget the promise of what's coming. Because what's coming is bigger. What's coming is better. What's coming is exactly what you were meant for. So I want you to do something. I want you to shift your perspective. Instead of seeing your loss as the end, see it as the beginning. Instead of seeing your pain as punishment, see it as preparation. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Ask, what is God preparing me for? Because when you change the way you see your situation, you change the way you move forward. When you stop looking at what's missing and start looking at what's coming, your faith gets stronger, your hope gets bigger, and your spirit refuses to quit. God is not done with you. This is not where your story ends. I know it hurts. I know it's hard, but keep trusting, keep believing, keep going. Because one day soon, You're going to look back at this season of your life and realize that everything you lost was actually leading you to something greater. And when you step into that blessing, when you receive what God had for you all along, you'll understand that the process was necessary. You'll understand why things had to happen the way they did. You'll understand that even when you didn't see it, even when you didn't feel it, God was working the whole time. So don't quit. Don't give up. Don't lose faith in the process, because when God is finished, when He brings you what He's been preparing for you, you'll see that it was all worth it. And you'll thank Him, not just for what He gave you, but for what He took away, because without the loss, you would have never stepped into the blessing. Pain has a way of making us forget the bigger picture. When you lose something, when a door closes, when a relationship ends, when an opportunity slips through your fingers, it's easy to focus on what's missing. It's easy to dwell on what's no longer there. You sit in that space of loss, replaying moments in your mind, wondering how things could have gone differently. You ask yourself, what did I do wrong? Why did this have to happen? How do I move forward from here? But I need you to hear me. God does not remove without replacing. He does not take away without the intention of giving something greater in return. But here's the thing. Before you can receive what He has for you, you have to let go of what's already gone. You can't hold on to something that no longer exists and expect to move forward. You can't cling to the past and step into the future at the same time. Letting go isn't easy. It hurts. It forces you to trust in something you cannot see. But that's what faith is. Faith is believing that even when something has been taken from you, God is still in control. Faith is understanding that what you lost was not the end. It was simply a transition, a setup for something greater. But most people don't see it that way. Most people hold on to their pain, their disappointment, their frustration. They allow their loss to define them instead of refining them. They get stuck in bitterness, in resentment, in regret. But you have a choice. You can either sit in the ashes of what used to be, or you can stand up and prepare yourself for what's coming next. Look at the story of Ruth. She lost everything: her husband, her home, her sense of security. She could have given up. She could have let grief consume her. But instead, she chose to move forward. She followed Naomi, even when she had no idea what the future held. And because she was willing to keep going, because she refused to let loss define her, God positioned her for something greater. She found herself in the fields of Boaz. And in that place of obedience, in that place of trust, God restored everything she had lost and more. She became part of something bigger than she could have ever imagined. That's what happens when you trust God's process. That's what happens when you refuse to let loss be the final chapter of your story. Because what you don't see right now, what you don't realize in the middle of your pain, is that God is working behind the scenes. He's shifting things, aligning things, preparing things. You may not see it yet, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. The problem is, too many people give up in the waiting. They lose faith in the in-between. They let their emotions dictate their decisions instead of trusting that God knows what He's doing. But you can't do that. You can't let temporary pain make you forget eternal promises. You can't let one season of loss make you believe that God has forgotten about you. He hasn't. What you lost was never the source of your blessing. It was simply a vessel God used for a time. And when that vessel was no longer needed, when it had served its purpose, He removed it to make space for something new. But if you're too busy looking back, if you're too focused on what's gone, you'll miss what's coming. I know it's hard. I know it doesn't always make sense, but you have to trust that God knows what He's doing. When He removes something, it's not to hurt you, it's to help you, it's to elevate you, it's to position you for something beyond what you could have imagined. So instead of asking, why did this happen to me? Start asking, what is God preparing me for? Instead of focusing on the loss, focus on the lesson. Instead of sitting in sorrow, stand in expectation, because what's coming next is greater than what you lost. You have to believe that. You have to walk in that truth, because when God replaces what you lost, you'll look back and realize that nothing was ever taken from you. It was simply making room for something greater. There's a moment after loss where everything feels still, like the world is moving on without you, but you're stuck in the space between what was and what will be. It's a painful place, a lonely place, a place where the questions are loud, but the answers feel distant. Why did this happen? What am I supposed to do now? How do I move forward? And in that moment, you have a choice. You can let loss define you, or you can let it refine you. You can stay in the pain, replaying the past over and over again, or you can step into the unknown, trusting that God has something greater ahead. Because here's the truth: God does not leave you empty-handed. It might feel like everything has been taken from you, like the loss is too great, like nothing good can come from this, but if you could see what God sees, if you could see what He has in store for you, you would understand why some things had to be removed. You would understand why certain doors had to close, why certain people had to walk away, why certain opportunities had to pass you by. Because what you lost was not the end of your story, it was the beginning of something new. But you can't receive what's next if you're still holding on to what's gone. You can't step into your future if your hands are full of the past. That's why God removes things. That's why He allows certain losses. Because He knows that if He doesn't take it away, you'll never let go. And if you never let go, you'll never make room for what He's trying to give you. Look at Job. He lost everything: his wealth, his family, his health, his fee, his love, his worth, his family, his health. Everything that once made his life full was stripped away in an instant. And yet, even in his pain, even in his confusion, he held on to his faith. He didn't understand why it was happening, but he refused to curse God. He refused to believe that loss was the end. And because of his faith, because he trusted even when it didn't make sense, God restored everything he had lost and more. That's the kind of faith you need. The kind of faith that says, even though I don't understand, I will trust. The kind of faith that says, even though I can't see what's next, I believe that God is working, because He is. Even in your loss, even in your pain, He is working, He is replacing, He is restoring. But you have to let go. You have to surrender. You have to stop fighting for what's already gone and start preparing for what's coming. Because when God replaces what you lost, it won't just be enough. It will be more than enough. It will be greater than you imagined, bigger than you prayed for, beyond what you thought was possible. But you have to be willing to move forward. You have to be willing to trust Him, even in the uncertainty, because on the other side of this loss is a blessing you can't yet see. On the other side of this pain is a purpose you haven't yet discovered. And when you finally step into it, when you finally receive what God has been preparing for you, you'll understand. You'll see that nothing was ever truly lost. It was simply making way for something better. So don't give up. Don't lose hope. Don't let this moment define you. Keep moving, keep trusting, keep believing, because when God replaces what you lost, you'll realize that what you thought was taken from you was actually making space for something far greater.